Blog Talk Radio.
Thank you and welcome, Dr. David Jubb.
Hey, mate. How you doing? Hope everybody's having a really great day. Yeah. Really, people have been very interested just to be learning a bit more about this time gone by, about shiny bones and foam houses, and the Native American Indians. But it is amazing that there is certainly Atlantean blood in a certain percentage of the Native American Indians. And across the population of the Earth as well. And then Atlantean civilization really influenced everything quite a bit. But you could see that it sometimes was like a pluralistic in the manner of accepting or not necessarily being able to educate others, in another way to be necessarily. But that back then, the fertility cults were sort of really fairly rife, But in a time gone by, shiny bones, of course, and foam houses, the Native Americans, they had 4 genders. And, of course, when the missionaries came, they only looked upon seeing things as just the roles which they had been cast into in their own paradigm, or you could say convention. And so they were not necessarily able to see what it was that was within the Native American culture, certainly the Winuks and the Burduks, but that their gender wasn't really related at all to sexuality, and nor was their unions and things, but it was much more, because of the lived mutual assistance and things, an extended family and loyalty on this sort of level and that. But the most prized people certainly were the people who really were able to walk both lines within life, and they could certainly build things and construct things and teach and nurture and look after people as well. But of course, as warmongering came to be ever more, it left a sort of a huge divide between people and created sort of polarized versions of the gender as we sort of see it today. But the Dogon even were a part of that back then, and still to this sort of day, they do practice sexual mutilating of the males. But song and music, Cloud told me, only just in days gone by, and always had just a little time to come up, to a higher note, and then it would take its time to come down, and it would work its way down slowly because the energy would come from above and down and into ourselves rather than from materialism out. And then call and response sort of singing and things would really be done. And banners and things would be lifted up a bit high to cause people to remember that they were in a family, and the drum beat would go out and it would sort of resonate, create resonance, and people would feel more union, and they'd use song and things to help to bring people together and that. But the fertility cults were on the fringes, of Atlantis, and they applied Atlantean knowledge really to subjugate others, and you could energize by words, usage, or you could have stripped energy from a coarser vibrating object. And the living spirit really was became to be controlled by fiction and sort of taken over by this fiction as a prejudice not reframed. And that of itself was a trauma reenactment syndrome where the victor's sort of behaviour was taken on. People didn't want to be the victim, but the victor. And they took on the victor's behaviour, and that then was really about harvesting other people's energy, and having not sort of really been able to keep their own energy, all they could do was harvest energy. And this was sort of like a psychological warfare that could be put. And then people would not know or ever be the wise to this, but that fear could have been caused to drip into the blood of persons, and blood then kind of not necessarily really been available to think, repair, and rid waste of itself, as blood kind of not really remained in the viscera but gone into the limb, for mobilization, yet typically sort of living, being in a suck sort of state, but a horror often and a fear kept people sort of like a big stick, people carried a big stick sort of thing. But Shiny Bones is a remembered beginning of all of that coming into America as well and settling on the eastern seaboard. And this was also during the time of the chieftains. And there were these mound people that came in, and they brought some of this sort of fertility cult stuff, which Cloud said the natives saw, and they felt that it was abhorrent. They couldn't understand how such evil could really be practiced like that. But the Atlantean mining was going on, and trade and exploration would bring sort of economic promise, as well as sort of fear of losing a very sort of a deep ancient way, as we've been talking about. But Cloud told us that it would take at least 4 years or more, to learn everything about what occurred back then in the story, to then sort of really be able to pass this on. But I spent in those 4 years and then another 5 with her, really learning what I could, to pass on this story and more of it, to the next shaman, in line. But the Toltecs were always educated, and the medicine people were always educated that first there was an empty space, and that I is this empty space. And this is what the Toltecs teach. And then sound and then sight came into this. But to look within and not outside of self, and things were done more circular, not square, and praying outside, which was a cute way to cause people not to really be able to look within themselves, and have to go underneath to understand rather than understand. And rather than looking within and looking within each other and ourselves to find what the answer is, people were trained to start to look on the outside and to be accepted, apparently, of something perfect on the outside, which the Toltec always taught that there was really no medium between you and this great spirit within yourself and everything else, which the Christians sort of considered that to be sort of a panentheistic type of thinking. But where doctrine would have been challenged by any fact at all, people often just went with a doctrine in the past, not really any fact much, you know. But the birth of this past sulliedness and contaminated sort of things of what was new wasn't really teaching at all of what the Toltecs taught, that not anything of any solidness of the past could ever contaminate this which is new now, and being ushering in this new era, and not to be made of any second-hand nothing, but totally not to sort of really be even the same river ever, obviously, that's passed through. And Tankashila represents this as a warmth and blood here and now, as a Christ-like energy inside. And Cloud called this, and the natives called this having hollow bones. But eye-awareness is this sort of balance where a self-realisedness is existing, where you've been able to chip away things so that you've cleared away any story that you could have come from, that are kind of been enacting things unknowledgeably to you or others. But the exact half eternally as empty, that makes up I. And then Am was this other half, exactly 50%, that was the body expressed as the sound of the crickets and the birds, the trees, and the sound of children's laughter and crying and caringness and affection. And as you live with your body eye open, God is sort of this I am, and not a person or a singular gender. But Cloud told me that these things sort of have really been confused a bit in the warmongering societies. So a pool of slaves could easily be had, you know, and these slaves had to be stripped to be half naked, she said, and the others then would be covered, and to exist really then to do society's sinful sort of loveless work. And then they were also taught that they had to sort of marry down, and then also dress down, and they were not allowed to dress up. And this is the story of Samson and Delilah, which Cloud says, of course, this is maybe the second oldest story that we have about this time. But this story was the custom that was adopted in these fertility cults. And in her it ants, which is the word inherit, in her it ants, it was not in him it ants, you see. And still to this day, wigs and frocks are used sort of, and it's called a mother tongue, and it's called the earth is her, and this sort of thing. But Cloud said this was quite ridiculous, all this sort of putting gender onto things, which that was quite an aberration. But all mystery was had to be stripped, Cloud said, from the real slave, and that slave had to not know that they were stripped of their power, and so that would begin at a very early age of their sexual mutilatedness and their acceptedness of half-nakedness and even nakedness in their exposedness in public. So the phallus would be put to be something in public, which it is today, of course, you know, but that the vagina not, you see, or the yoni. But and why and yoni, which you comes from, which you I is this inner eye, which the Atlanteans taught, which has been confused a bit, with Horus and all sorts of stuff. But this eye really was this inner eye, and only you could access this through affection, you see. This teaching was something within, but that people couldn't really look on the outside to find it, because as we've been saying, people were being used really to have a role, so that prostitutes could easily be, and the poor slaves could commit legalized sin, you see. And so those slaves had to be sexually mutilated, and then where creativity is a cockfight sort of is enacted out instead, and then relief comes, you see, for the males, and the females would be sort of cheerleaders, having to sort of lead this on, but it would be sort of a bit of a horror show, and this was sort of like a frenzied rock concert of, a debauchery in a way, and then it was sensational, you see. But this cockfight sort of would then be put sort of in this place where creativity should be, and then people would really feel the relief of the fight put in there instead, you see. And then to be effective in breeding an armed prostitute, you had to trick the person to get a little more pay. They could be received of some sort of privilege, but, of course, to do loveless work, yet as a sold person or soldier, it was then so daddy pay and stay farther away, and happens often enough, but that his body sort of was not accorded any value in this situation, you see, because, of course, you could see that as the males would be used to settle the older people's scores, they would use younger boys, and they would just sip coffee and watch the outcome of that, you see. But then they would put monies forward and that sort of thing, just enough to allow one side not necessarily really to win, really, because then they could control both the sides, you see. But so she really had to remain the object of desire in Woollyhood, the story, and these stories, you see. And that's very important, so that the slave would just merely remain the subject matter that's talked about, but that more of the act of the beast riding its own appetite, sort of drunk. And that's sort of very important image to be able to put, because to have an armed prostitute, you've got to be able to consider that the male is not formed properly, you see. So male, as a word, is the word that's put into people's unconscious minds, hopefully to cause people to think that males are not born of God, I guess. But Clyde told us that the past sort of Atlantean golden age was a living spirit which really didn't have any sickness put into the psyche, you see. She said that this teaching during the period of time is going on, but that forces have been to cause things to not necessarily have this story come out or sort of really be funded by anything sort of from Woollyhood. But because this time sort of is equal to money right now, you see, at the time in the past was equivalent to creativity. Yet now a phantom sort of is installed, you see, and that fiction sort of would have been applied, and has been applied sort of to trick the person to be considered as not sort of really being the living spirit, but having been owned. And the word own was a very dirty, filthy word to use, because this was not something necessarily people had that they had in common with each other. And so own and usury were sort of similar words, and people really were focused in Atlantean times more on what we had that was which is universal, which we have in our hearts that we share, rather than a private person owning something in a communistic type of condition. But the standing that this is truth because of what's mutually beneficial, yet one rules and is able to rule, you see, the 6 billion or more, and can really do it just with a big stick. And you can get things done with a big stick and whack, and there's all sorts of whacks and miggy sob and soppy woppy and lovey-dovey sorts of our trauma reenactment sort of syndrome sort of behaviours. But fear was what really was caused to come to be. Yet persons could remain and maintain that sort of a sickness to have created that fear, you see. And then control was really lovely. You see, and then people would just rationalise the control that exists, and which is really a great loss of love, and only seeing self sort of as a fiction to pull the person that what they saw as a reflection in the mirror that became named sort of was owned and then dated. And those are things important to have a warehouse receipt to be owned, you see. And that fiction then could be accepted as a person, but that, this is just a fiction in a person's mind, but that, people are born with very beautiful brains and then they're given these minds, you see, Cloud said. But that's very necessary to create an armed prostitute, of course, and that could really be used to apply deadly force. Society sort of has to have had apparently, and so then the body of that person had to be sold. And so a sold person had to be trained, of course, and had to be made, and then you'd see them doing all sorts of manoeuvres against themselves to mutilate themselves, really, and learn how to mutilate the other male. But so instrument sort of death was eyed by him, and that in this time, of course, people really learned how to apply other ways to resolve things through educating people and being a warrior on another level. But a relentless sort of instrument of death had to be put into his hands, which would either be something which would stab or cut or sort of kill in some way. That had to be sort of put into his play, and then his play had to do with everything about his behaviour being arrested, you see, and arresting other boys' behaviour. Very importantly, and then her play behaviour had to really be sort of being put with her generative form of dolls and her innocence, very importantly, and so she could be remained in her innocence. So this is really the story of Delilah, and then how Samson's eyes were put out. Not that his eyes were literally put out, but he could not really see her. She would be then covered, you see, and then this would be really a way to install some great deficit in Samson. His head then would just lay in her lap. So this is sort of really the act of the fertility cults, and this is sort of part of the sheepalizing that's going on today. And then it's very important, of course, that children would have been fatherless, because the father is the one who's really aware of this, and that and then you've got to really do what you can to get rid of fathers, of course, because then if you've got rid of fathers, then there would be really no voice left, you see. But the cause of all of this to be merely just a piece of owned property as a warehouse receipt definitely not really be charged with anything at all. Those are the things that's very important to create a state of siege, and then people's brains have to be put to sleep, you see, so they don't know that that's sort of going on, which can easily be done with fluoride and stuff in the shower water, but that's another story. But you've got to make sure no one's around, to report any protected disclosures or conduct. And then certainly anyone who has whistleblowingness of that sort of thing, it sort of can't really go anywhere. And anyone who does have protected disclosures today and is participating in protected conduct and things, that really has to be disappeared, you see, and then of course it can be really very easily retaliated again. And so then you've got a society a lot like Sweden, which is the number one country in the world where people are not able to get along with each other, you see, where the weapons are being produced. But you've got to stop the child's ability really to learn, and they've got to be taken away from the parents, and this Stockholm syndrome has to be put over the world, and then a McDonaldizing and everybody to bed at a certain hour and up to work in the factory. But only letting them be with the same age is very important to be able to create the armed prostitute and segregate the children also. It's very important to be able to create that armed prostitute. But the fluoride vapor in the shower, of course, added in, it really works sort of fairly nicely to block proper pineal function, and then people knew that they could easily use toxins and poisons and things, to dumb down people, so that you would really be able to have a pool of slaves that just could commit legalized sin, and the trees and plants and people could really be owned, and biology would grow the labels inside the person, and then the people that owned everyone else, they would sort of know who they owned. But fluoride and bromide, really does stick, and all of the calcium phosphates and the super this and super that on the land and in the mines is very important to sort of calcify and zombify. So people have to be tricked, of course, that you must be a superman and a not really a superwoman, but you have to use super phosphates and super foods and things. But these, as I said, all are very high-level calcium phosphates. But it's important, sort of, the message is that you put super in front of it to make it better than just light food. And that is very important, sort of, in the whole matrix, because it assists to help to zombify the population, especially if you can get rock salt going and all of this sort of thing, and pharmaceuticals. And if you can marginalize people who really are telling the truth, things can work fairly well. But the suicide level for males has to be around about 25,000% more than her in these societies, which that's about what it is as he comes into his gender role in relationship to her. So it sort of really has to be a very unsafe place for him, you see. And then an armed prostitute sort of is readily available for the taking, but they can easily be programmed with toys, and not to really be interactive at all or communicative, and drugged, you see, which I think in America 90-something% of the children that are drugged are boys. So in the wars and things that would come sort of thing, and certainly the martial law and white males becoming targeted, very importantly, by the matrix, the infrastructure sort of exists And, moratorium can easily be put there, and the Living Spirit's request here really is for reform in banking, that's all. But otherwise, likes of the phantom attack of fiction, being, it just sort of won't let boys sleep around the world. They're dreaming sort of of their bodies being ravaged. And the thin wall and the harsh, loud sounds outside their walls in the night, really sort of are put to be able to harvest the young boy's energy and his dreaming. And so, things can sort of be politically correct and even mob attack sort of thing. So the young boy could be in bed huddled sort of to lie and just sort of hearing the voice of a young male outside pleading for mercy, and then just sort of nothing explained, but only the sounds of chopping of knives and machetes and things, and silence after that. But you've got sort of really a misguided mutant neighbourhood watch sort of going on, of course, and which is very important for the hand above the government, to be able to control people, and that people wouldn't really wake up to that, you see. But the armed prostitute training really awry is really just a heartless club, and that's the thieves of mob rule, you see. And then, of course, the mob can also rule. But cognitive dissonance is really what's very important to be able to create, in the warmongering societies where you've got the newscasters and people and they justify everything going on, you see. That's very important. They can just justify it. Because the two parts that are not integrated could just continue on as a frightened sort of scarecrow or a tin man, tax identification number, and people could just be Richard the Lionheart, a lion, but you've got a bit of a pin in your paw or something, and so you sort of can't move. And those are the things which are sort of very important to be put into the psyche, you see. And then certainly evidence of solid fossils and things of civilization in Asia going back 18,000, 20,000, have these very high-tech societies existing, certainly long before Noah's Ark. You've got hieroglyphic symbolic language being used. You've got earth maps being found, certainly that date back 150 million years. And in Asia, you've got stories of how the crustaceans fled north to cooler waters, which you've got going on. You've got remote Arctic sort of Greenland towns disappearing, which you have, of course, today. You've got ice cap melting and stories such, and you've got lucrative mining opening up. Doesn't it sound familiar? It's amazing, isn't it? But the Toltecs saw sort of behavioural processes that really bound everything together, and the processes of holding things together and the spinning forces that held things generally together, and then what was a force that rid things of uselessness, called deletion, and then there was the ability to be able to shape and change and distort, and then these are the brain processes that they taught people: generalization, deletion, and distortion. The native Indian medicine people taught their medicine people to be able to focus on, because these were three brain processes, you see, and you could see that if something was being generalized, which could clear up, create a greater truth, or you could see that information would have been deleted in the past, but that that would be very important that you bring this information back, or that information was distorted in some way, and that could be looked to see that it was distorted, and that these involve universal systems, involving our own sort of internal processing that created a map, and that this map inside ourselves really is not the territory, but that this map is really an internal map, and you get this map by generalizing, because you can't put everything into your map, deleting, stuff that's sort of really not pertinent, and distorting, observing to see what's distorted and changing and shaping what's needing to be shaped. And this is really what life does, you see. These brain processes and whole brain functioning can have been misused, and an internal map could have been put what that was impoverished. And the Toltec really is about this awakening of I awareness, and is taught in techniques to awaken I through ritual and storytelling. But no one needs really to be taught what's natural, Lukey, you see. Just the self to chip away what's unnatural. And then the ancient ones taught that there is a use of narcissism, that this is a grist, and you can't just live in a sheltered workshop to clear things up. But what's unnatural needs to be cleared away to have an enrichment and more impoverishment disappeared of what has been a person's inner map. But that this is a more accurate rendition of our past and where we are going into our future, and the actual territory and the process universally of generalizations having been used in the past, which can have omitted important information, information that can have been deleted, but that you've got to delete stuff which is useless and not pertinent or important, and you have to create and construct what's necessary, to allow us to go beyond prefix set patterns of response to be able to survive. You see, and these are the patterns really which create life. And awareness as I really is beyond any sensory experience as am, and am is a sensory motor experience of being awake, you see, and dreaming and being deeply asleep. So you've got these three states, aware, and you've got an awareness as I that is beyond these three brain states of being, because you can have an awareness that the brain was in some state, yet the frontal cortex really has grown out of anatomy implicating interest and pleasure, and aversion has grown out of anatomy and neurologically implicating inhibition and repugnance and avoidance, and pleasure and pleasure and interest area of the brain create whole brain functioning, and aversion causes limited mind function by neurologically inhibiting the amygdala and tegmentum, which are aversive centers of the brain. The septal region, as pleasure and interest is existing, neurologically inhibits the aversive componentry. But if aversive componentry was large enough, it could have been neurologically inhibiting the frontal cortex, you see. So the ancient ones knew that if they could put a bit of a slow drip of beer, people could really not necessarily be, with their blood, you see, in their viscera to be able to repair themselves. But applying whole brain functioning principle can allow a person to have a more accurate map and gender egalitarianism, and yet this is sort of a map, but it's not really a territory, and it consists of whole brain functioning processes, which is possible for people to be able to learn more. But even as humid air, it does condense into liquid droplets and you might not see that it does this, it just sort of looks like humid air. But then that's where liquid droplets come from, and water then starts to flow, you see, and this flowing is starting to happen. And then this water really can have frozen and gone through other transitional phases, just as cosmic photon, as light, as tachyon also goes through condensation phases. You as an astronaut in your consciousness and phases of the mind in creating this map can be applied and universal processes fundamental to all us as sentient beings here on the earth, so that we could live together and live in peace and harmony and get this word out. Even the Christ of Pisces was asked to follow this Christ of this time, who is the water pourer, to know where to go to the Last Supper. But one's identity really is pristine as the sky, Lukey, and yet behaviour really may not have been. But your identity, Lukey, and everyone listening, is pristine as the sky. And though what you can accomplish and what you could have and have had as even a belief is absolutely pale, mate, in comparison to this, which there is no light in between all of us. But compared with who you really are, as an astronaut in this eye awareness theme as we're teaching this. But as you, as also, this astronaut strategy is existing, that you've cleared away story inside, and that the map you're building has 3 brain processes involving only 3 possible responses. And either it's a generative clearing away waste, or it's a creating and recreating in life, and either it's congruent or incongruent, or it's sort of a creative looping until you exit, into congruency. But this consciousness sort of is a flowing principle of string theory in the Toltec tradition, and certainly Dogon, and it's amazing that these are people who have very deep scientific insight and did apply it in their language, but it doesn't always work, of course, because you've got forces that can have corrupted things, yeah. Are we with each other?
Absolutely.
It's amazing, Lukey, because in colloidal biology, you've got life colloid organelle interior, of the cell, which stores this energy, even like as in form of memory, that you can know what to do where you are. But this energy storage is in a form seen in the body as an electrical field, and this really is between positively charged life colloid interior sort of organelle as negatively charged and positively charged sort of plates. And this sort of charging is going on, And our blood corpuscle, by our heart percussion and the sound of this story and your relaxedness of your shoulders as you're listening to this beautiful story, your heart percussion is equal and opposite magnitude, in its act on the red blood corpuscle, and a storage charge as capacitance sort of occurs. And in colloidal biology, you've got cell electronics, which you could read about, but this is really electrolytic, and it's an electrolytic capacitor, as you and I are like wet cell batteries. But monatomic element acts as a superconductor in our body, and white gold, life colloid, and iodine, fluorine, and magnesium supplement, and these light foods and things assist. But blood and the body's design really has its gaseous element rotated and, could we say, sort of vortexed or twisted to oscillate, as it comes in through tubercle and villi and visceri, to oscillate, and colloidally, high energy spin electron sort of is built as a result. But there's a diamagnetism which we've been learning a bit about. But there's a diamagnetism which we've been learning a bit about. But there's a diamagnetism which we've been learning a bit about. But